we often get asked to do this, especially for our PHA people who are on the other side of the world. I'd also like to just ask you before we start more formally to please just mute yourself at the moment, and then when we have Nick's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion, and we'll either use the raise hands function on Zoom, or you can physically put your hand up or write something in chat. And I'll just say in advance that if I pronounce your name incorrectly, I think last time I pronounced a Samoan name in Fijian, so please bear with me because I don't know everybody. So today in PHA webinar series, I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Nicholas Hoare, who is well known to many of us, not just through the Pacific History Association, but also through the Journal of Pacific History, where Nick is an editorial general, administrator, assistant, all sorts of things. And Nick is currently a Pacific History Research Fellow at the Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University, and he lectures about Australia and Oceania and World War II in the Pacific Islands. Nick's a recently minted PhD, graduating in 2021 with a thesis on the history of phosphate mining on Makatea in the Tuamotu archipelago. And before that, Nick studied at Victoria University of Wellington. Now today we've got a very interesting webinar on mining futurities, imagined futures for the Pacific's 3 great phosphate islands. So I'll hand it over to Nick, and also you can put questions in the chat section if you need to. That's great. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Helen. Thanks, Jackie, and also thanks, Helen. I hope you can hear me. I think, yep, I think it's all good. We should get started. I suppose before I start, I need to acknowledge the unceded Indigenous lands that I'm speaking on. It's Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in my case. I've been really fortunate to be passing through this country, I suppose, for a lot longer than I expected. As Jackie said, I came from Wellington in New Zealand. I thought I'd just be here for 3 years, but I've been here for about 8 years now. So I pay my respects to the Indigenous elders of this territory, past, present, and emerging. Yeah, so as Jackie kind of introduced me there, I've been working slowly on the subject for a number of years now. My PhD, if I can put it this way, my PhD I think was about the making of a phosphate island, Makatea, which is on the right here on the PowerPoint. But now I'm probably more interested in the unmaking of phosphate islands, if that makes sense. Thinking about how these places might be able to shed their sort of 20th century characteristics and their, and just become regular Polynesian or Micronesian islands again. Sorry, I think this is Christine that needs to be muted. And this concept of unmaking a phosphate island, I think it's easier said than done, especially when there's residual phosphate deposits still hanging around waiting to be mined. As such, this paper is situated somewhere in between old and new research. I'm hoping that the new element is in the fact that I'm bringing multiple phosphate islands together into the same conversation. To my mind, this hasn't been done all that much, especially not when it comes to Makatea and these other two. As Jackie said, I'm dressing this all up with this hard to pronounce word, Futurities, which came from this edited collection here, especially Chris Ballard's afterword in this edited collection. I know some people have told me they were coming to this seminar today to find out what this word means. I'll probably save most of that theoretical discussion for the written paper later on. I'm also using this term, the Pacific's 3 great phosphate islands. It's not my own term. That's how they appear under the heading of phosphate islands in this 2009 Encyclopedia of Islands. I'm very aware that we could be adding other phosphate islands to this conversation. Places like Angawa here and Palau was mined by the Germans and the Japanese. There's also Walpole Island off the Grande Terre in New Caledonia. I don't think he's here on the Zoom call, but Matt Cavett gave a really good paper about Walpole Island at the PHA conference last year. And we might want to cheat a little bit and put in Christmas Island, Christmas Island, which is in the Indian Ocean rather than the Pacific, but it has many commonalities with Nauru and Barnaba, above all the fact that it was also mined by the British Phosphate Commissioners later on. Christmas Island is interesting because it's also the most advanced island as far as rehabilitation goes. So I've got a bit to get through today. I think Helen said all 30 slides, good luck. So I better get going with this paper that I've got prepared. So on the morning of 23 February 1987 began an independent commission of inquiry into the rehabilitation of the worked out phosphate lands in Nauru, one of the Pacific's 3 great phosphate islands alongside neighbouring Barnaba and Makatea in eastern Polynesia. The chairman of the commission, Christopher Weramantry, then professor of law at Monash University, opened the historic occasion by underlining the lack of serious interdisciplinary inquiry into the island's post-mining fate. Though it had been keenly discussed in the build-up to Nauruan independence, rehabilitation was one of the topics brushed aside in the rush to meet that January 1968 independence deadline, and subsequently was never seriously revisited. So thus, at the bidding of the Nauruan government, Weramantry and his fellow commissioners convened a series of public and private sittings over an 11-month period, calling on witnesses with, I quote, historical, economic, sociological, ecological, technological, and legal expertise across Nauru, Australia, and New Zealand to investigate solutions to the problem of rehabilitating topsides that former pandanus land, turned phosphate land. It constitutes roughly 4/5 of the island. This appeared in the Nauru Bulletin, calling Nauruans to come to one of these sitting days on Nauru. So looking at the proceedings 3.5 decades later, some might see the fulfillment of what Weramantry predicted would be an exhaustive inquiry into the problem of rehabilitation in the minutest of details, whereas others will observe nothing more than a lengthy list of hopes and dreams for the future, many of which hitherto remain unrealized. To be sure, only so much can be gained when we're revisiting these meetings as words on a page, shorn of all the corporal signs, nervousness, frustration, and other emotion of people giving evidence to the commission. But as a historical artifact, the way I've met it is through the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau, as a historical artifact, and the transcripts here reveal a bullish optimism for making amends for the past, regardless of the technical and economic challenges that rehabilitation still posed at that point. So, traces of anger so synonymous with Nauru's phosphate history were there for sure, but there was also an underappreciated practical or constructive side to the deliberations. Expert after expert was brought in to meet this challenge laid down by the Nauruan leaders, who from as early as 1964 had made it clear that they preferred to risk rehabilitation of their home island over the Australian preferred option of resettlement. As independence leader, President Hammer de Robert commented at the time, rehabilitation had always been uppermost in our minds. Without it, he thought the idea of a permanent future for our people will be doomed to failure. So I start this paper on post-mining futures, or futurities, with Nauru, not just because it has become this sort of poster child for small states facing imperial era exploitation, post-colonial resource curses, but I also want to start with Nauru because of this unique public window afforded to the Nauruans by this Commission of Inquiry. An opportunity for Nauruans to express their visions for the future in public. The fact that this possibility has so far been denied to the other so-called phosphate islanders, such as the Banabans or the Mihiroa or Makatea, provides the justification for this comparative framing of the paper. Different geologies, geographies, ecologies, and extractive colonial histories naturally lead to different post-mining histories, attitudes to rehabilitation, and visions for the future. But nonetheless, I think there are more than enough commonalities across the three islands to warrant this call for both islander and non-islander researchers, practitioners, policymakers to avoid thinking about the historic legacies of environmental violence in isolation. Using the Nauruan Commission of Inquiry as a model for further investigation into other unresolved legacies of phosphate mining across the Pacific, I want us to think about how other phosphate islanders might benefit from similar exercises and what kinds of discussions could have eventuated had they had the chance to fully articulate their visions for the future at so-called phosphate's end. So according to at least one Nauruan at the time, the importance of the Commission of Inquiry was such that he thought the soul of the young Nauruan nation was at stake. The soul of the young Nauruan nation was at stake. By contrast, if we are to believe the sort of imagery that's created in this poem, I'm not sure if you can read it there, it's about Barnaba, perhaps mining was so comprehensive that it already sucked the soul out of the Barnaban people. We know, of course, that this is not true, but articles that came out in The Guardian, I'm not sure if you remember, midway through last year, about droughts and the water crisis affecting those who still live on the island, it certainly lends weight to such imagery in this poem. How do we as a community of scholars then respond to Katerina Tiewa's statement that appeared in The Guardian newspaper last year, saying that, you know, this whole thing is a series of crises. We can't just keep telling the story of devastation and vulnerability over and over again. Where does the crisis end, if not with justice? The Barnaban calls for rehabilitation must be heeded, according to Katerina Tiewa. The problem, however, which is playing out on Makatea at the moment, is that given the current economic climate, you do not get rehabilitation without another round of residual phosphate mining. It's through mining that you have the money to complete the rehabilitation, right? And while this might be okay on some phosphate islands, for Makatea, the third phosphate island, a place mined by a French company until 1966, the issue I think is a little bit more complex when you get on the ground. So as I know I've been known to do, I think I'm weaseling my way out of a solid argument here. I'm not confident enough to suggest a cogent response to Tiewa's call for justice. So instead, I plan to do that annoying historians thing where I'm going to historicize the idea of rehabilitation so that we might better understand what options are still on the table for the future and what has already been tried or at least articulated in the past. The question driving this paper is therefore, what did these phosphate islanders want for their islands once mining had ended? Because it clearly can't be the situation where we have found ourselves today on, on Nauru, Barnaba, or Makatea. That's less than ideal. So let's explore this first, I think, by going to Nauru, an island familiar to many of you and definitely not short of controversy over the years. So to say that the Nauruans have a privileged position in this history is plainly inappropriate, but it is nonetheless worth dwelling upon the quirk of imperial history, which brought Nauru under German colonial rule and set off a chain of events that led to its passage from the so-called Sacred Trust of the League of Nations Permanent Mandates Commission to the United Nations trusteeship system, and eventually to this Commission of Inquiry and then The Hague. The legal and political history of Nauru has been extremely well chronicled, right? Often by legal scholars who had a hand in its making. So I'm only going to offer a brief outline here. I think a lot of us are familiar with the broad brushstrokes, After having wrested Nauru away from the Germans at the outbreak of the Great War, Australia assumed post-war civil administration of the island on behalf of the British Empire, not as an outright colonial possession, of course, but in the guise of a Class C mandated territory. You might be familiar with these two books. Nauru's phosphate riches were what attracted Prime Ministers Billy Hughes and Bill Massey to fight for its administrative control and to establish a state-owned monopoly with the help of the United Kingdom called the British Phosphate Commissioners. Despite numerous critics pointing out the incongruity of the mining arrangement with the enlightened principles of the League of Nations, as much from people who were proponents of free trade between League members as those who were concerned with the well-being of the mandated populations, It was under the British Phosphate Commissioners that 34 million tonnes of Nauruan phosphate were mined and sold to Australian and New Zealand farmers at cost price. We all know this history. As Weramantry noted at the time, the fiduciary relationship created between Nauru on the one hand and Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom, the so-called partner governments on the other, and the later group's violation of this duty through their sort of unabated phosphate mining gave the Nauruans a rare basis from which to launch their case in international law. Aided by the 10-volume report that resulted from the Commission of Inquiry, Nauru brought a famous case against Australia to the International Court of Justice in 1989. It went through, the processes, a number of years. It resulted in 1993 in a 107 million Australian dollar out-of-court settlement. To further support the Nauruans, Weramantry summarised the findings of the Commission of the Inquiry in this monograph here, concluding that the responsibility for the rehabilitation of all lands mined prior to independence lay with the partner governments. That said, by focusing on assigning responsibility for rehabilitation, almost entirely focusing on this aspect, assigning responsibility, the responsibility question, Weramantry ignored the second purpose of the commission, which was to investigate how rehabilitation might play out on the island in the near future. As Barry Connell, counsel assisting the Commission of Inquiry, reminded readers a decade later, the commission was not designed to simply look at the question of responsibility for the environmental disaster at Nauru, but as importantly, had to look at the feasibility of restoring such lands. One of the principal obstacles for the Nauruans during the inquiry was overcoming the pernicious claim that land on topside held little value in the pre-mining era. As was explained by Pacific historian Barry McDonald, one of the first witnesses called to speak to the commission, Nauru was always viewed slightly differently to Banaba, because the vast majority of Nauruans lived on the non-phosphate-bearing coconut land on the littoral regions of the island. According to the needs rather than the rights-based paradigm that dominated the early 20th century thinking of the BBC, of the miners, neither rehabilitation nor resettlement would be needed on Nauru in the future, because unlike on Banaba, where phosphate mining destroyed homes and important food-bearing trees, it was determined that Nauruan livelihoods never actually depended on this land. Yet according to the pastor, James Angamea of the Nauruan Congregational Church, and many other Nauruans who took the stand throughout this inquiry, the quote here, "Topside is not a place which Nauruans regarded as nothing. It was divided into numerous family-held plots with customary usage rights widely respected. As Angamea, he's the father, I think, of the current Nauruan president, as he reminded the audience that day, his grandmother died and was buried on his family land up on Topside. It was, of course, covered with pandanus trees, so during the harvest period, people would stay up there for weeks on end in temporary dwellings collecting pandanus fruit, and at other times of the year, people would catch noddy birds for household consumption." This is a photo I took when I was in Suva the other day in the Thurston Gardens. But, so aside from pandanus, there was also what they called tomano trees. Calophyllum, Inophyllum, I think it's called Io in Nauruan. And these were used, I think this is a young one, they can grow a lot larger than this, and these were used to construct houses, canoes, and support local crafts, tables, walking sticks, fence posts, etc. Just like the tree was put to use in pre-mining times of Makatea, these trees are all on the plateau in Makatea as well. Oil and bark from this tree was used for medicinal purposes as well. So whether Topside was being championed for its traditional utility, or as Connell did at one point, he likened it to a backwards recreational getaway or a picnic area, I think it's important that its constant evocation recalls Chris Ballard's recent proposition that to know where you've come from, first you need to know where you're going. Applied to this case, Ballard's inversion of the usual aphorism requires us to more closely examine the ways in which Nauruan and other phosphate pasts have been invoked over the years. In the words of Ballard, the past is constantly rethought, reworked, and rewritten, not as the present unfolds, but rather as our imagined futures shift and make new demands on the present and the past. Now, I'm not saying this at all to cast doubt over Nauruan assertions that topside was an essential part of their lives. After all, Hamadurobit insisted that it was stupid to say that we've never used this land, but rather it is important for understanding the meanings that people attach to this fabulously roomy word, rehabilitation. It also perfectly explains why the British Phosphate Commissioners and the partner governments, who are willing to do anything to avoid assuming responsibility for rehabilitating these mined out lands in the future, would create this legal fiction about topside land never being used. Framed in another way, would rehabilitation of the mined out lands require turning it into a productive agricultural space? This was the straw man argument put forward by officials working for the partner governments. Or were the Nauruans merely asking for it to be returned to a usable state? On this score, de Robert clearly articulates his belief that, like all Coral Islanders, the Nauruans were fish and coconut people, not agricultural people. To reinforce his point, he points to Barnaba and asks, what are they growing in agriculture? In other words, he critiques the Western idea of fertility as being tied to agricultural production and insists upon a truth that holds equally, I think, for Nauruans as well as other Phosphate Islanders, that the people were not asking for anything new by rehabilitation, just for something that could be used again. Told that the Commission of Inquiry was taking seriously the population's right to dream, the Nauruans, who had by now endured decades of phosphate mining, colonialism, and a brutal Japanese occupation during the Second World War, were noticeably more reticent in their articulation of their dreams than the non-Nauruans who spoke at length about their plans. Perhaps we need to look no further than our models, our present decolonial debates to explain this demeanor of the Nauruans. You know, here I'm thinking of people on Twitter. You've got Set the Scholars suggesting all these wonderful decolonial possibilities through the university. And in response, you have a simple Indigenous clarion call to give their lands back. Press further on the Nauruan definition of rehabilitation, de Robert responded that Nauruans associated it with real life. It was about making the land whole again. So unlike the Nauruan case, making the land whole again stopped being a serious possibility for the Barnabans on Ocean Island during the Second World War, if not several decades earlier. Despite having forced the Pacific Phosphate Company to insert a clause into their contracts in 1913 about needing to return all these worked out lands to the original owners, and that they shall replant such lands wherever possible with coconuts and other food-bearing trees, both in the lands already worked out and in those to be worked out in the future, the Barnaban environment remains more degraded today than even that on Nauru. We've already seen some comments from historian Barry McDonald comparing the different logics that were applied to the two islands in the early years of mining. A logic that necessitated greater attention or consternation in the Barnaban case because the phosphate land was inseparable from habitable or productive land. In the words of acting resident commissioner Arthur Mahaffey, were all the phosphate to be removed, the island would become perfectly uninhabitable by man. Half-hearted attempts at replanting the mined out areas with coconut trees were made by the Pacific Phosphate Company, the original mining company. However, by about 1917, the project was judged a failure. Resident Commissioner E.C. Elliott said the plan was as dead as the trees which have been planted in the worked out areas from time to time. After this point, there was no more efforts to rehabilitate the mined out areas. Why did the plan fail? It was always half-hearted, I think, from the start. They never made plans to reintroduce soil to the mined out areas before attempting to plant the coconuts. And this key word in the clause here, wherever possible, that saved the company from having to try too hard. By the 1920s, resettlement of the Barnaban population was being openly discussed. And by 1926, it was seriously entertained as, this is the terminology they used, as the ultimate solution of the problem. The dispersal of the Barnaban population to other Micronesian islands during the Japanese occupation period opened the door to this ultimate solution. We remember, the resettlement of the Barnabans. It was organized, I guess, by the resident commissioner of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony at the time, the future ANU historian Harry Maud, carried out by the Solomon Islands District Commissioner coast watcher turned Barnaban advisor for New Zealand, the New Zealand man, Donald Kennedy. Donald Kennedy, he visited the Barnabans in exile when they were on Cosray. And the way this story goes, this is one narrative of it. He basically threatened whoever wanted to return to Barnaba instead of Rambi Island in Fiji, that if they go to Barnaba, that their phosphate royalties would dry up. So in December 1945, the Barnabans went to Rambi in what was meant to be a temporary arrangement while their home island was being cleaned up after the war. However, this temporary solution crystallized into the partner government's ultimate solution when 85% of Barnabans voted to remain more permanently on Rambi in 1947. So like that of Nauru, many Pacific peoples and historians are familiar with Barnaba's phosphate history, and more specifically, the Barnaban attempts to seek redress in London for the United Kingdom's failure to rehabilitate these lands. At the time, the Barnaban cases against the phosphate commissioners for compensation for the lands that should have been replanted with coconut trees and the Crown for a breach of trust were the longest running in British history, the longest running legal cases, court cases in British history. The December 1976 rulings, however, were almost wholly unsatisfactory, despite Judge McGarry finding the BPC and colonial government negligent on the replanting issue. Charismatic leader Rotan Tito, who went to London, who stayed at London for this whole time, he did not find his British justice that he was promised. The $1.25 million compensation deal apparently barely covered the Barnabans' legal fees. So as it was concluded in this interesting documentary by the BBC, Go Tell It to the Judge, it took the courts 105 days to come to no conclusion about the amount of replanting damages, 116 days to decide that in the breach of trust issue, they didn't have a case at all. There would be no £20 million compensation, just more and more incomprehensible legal words. Maud, I think, Harry Maud, for his part, he thought that the judgment was unexceptionable. He believed Judge McGarry's personal expressions on morality, essentially anachronistic, the sort of arguments that would ensure the failure of any historical thesis. He warned against transferring any further money to the Barnabans as it would supposedly get in the way of their rehabilitation as a community. This is what he was concerned about. So in contrast to this, we have this article here that I came across again in the USP library a few weeks ago by Katerina Tiewa, who at the time was a master's student. I think it's a delicately argued critique of development planning among Barnabans on Rambi and outside experts. Titled No More Pity, like Ballard in his 2018 afterword, she too referred to the highly contested issue of history as a reinterpretation of the past for contemporary agendas, in this case for development. Despite this notion of history as a reinterpretation of the past, she judged it probably less important than the ways that historical experiences shape community worldviews in the present. Seen in these terms, Barnaban experiences of negative development or undevelopment, which saw them regress on a Western linear development scale from a position of affluence during the mining years to economic subsistence once mining had ended, unsurprisingly constrained their visions for the future. Just as the Nauruans would always argue, back when resettlement was an option for them, being apart from their home island was never supposed to be understood as a permanent state, nothing stopped them from having attachments to both islands, whether it would be Barnaba and Rambi, or Nauru and the other small islands that were scouted for them off the Queensland coast or in Fiji as well. So sure, the likes of Harry Maud, Fort Roten Tito and the Barnabans were wanting the best of both worlds when they said they wanted to have access to both Barnaba and Rambi. The Barnabans would say at that point, they would decide which one would suit them, at the end of mining. But the Barnabans, like the Nauruans, worked out, they understood very early on, I think, that everything that had been prepared for them in the name of benevolent development came out of phosphate money and not aid. Phosphate money that they believed to be theirs in the first place. And thus, given it was Barnaban phosphate money that purchased Rambi and not Maud organized it, of course, there was no rush to choose where the future was required to lie, especially not if the phosphate lands could be rehabilitated as was originally promised to them. Anyway, before we, there's a lot of more people who are a lot more knowledgeable about this Barnabin case than I am. So I should add that this desire to see Barnaba rehabilitated has been picked up by Stacey King. I understand she's a descendant of an early phosphate mining family. She's the wife, now widow, of the late Barnabin elder Ken Segra. And so she's developed these sort of popular websites online, barnaba.com, Barnaba Vision, and Barnabin Voice, and has been campaigning for this rehabilitation issue for several decades. These calls, perhaps from Stacey King more recently, follows earlier plans, I think, to rehabilitate areas of the island by the Roche brothers. These were in the late 1980s and carried on to the early 1990s. I'm not too sure what happened to these projects, so I'm hoping somebody in the audience might be able to enlighten me. There's so much more that we could explore about this Barnabin case. You know, the request for independence from the Kiribati, Fiji, the internal politics of the Rambi Council of Elders. But in the interest of time, I just want to say that the important thing to note is that despite living on Rambi, the idea that Barnabin futures would be solely restricted to Fiji was not shared by the majority of their leaders, who consistently pushed for the rehabilitation of their original island. These are all points well made in Katerina Tiawa's Consuming Ocean Island. The fact that Barnaba was a smaller island than both Nauru and Makatea raised the stakes from the beginning and raised the spectre of a more dramatic solution, this ultimate solution, to the problem of mining and the livelihood of the original population. As we shift here to my final case study, which is that of Makatea, I want to draw your attention to this newspaper article from 1989, which refers to Australian plans to investigate rising sea levels in Kiribati. The point is made that if sea levels continue to rise due to global warming, only the raised coral atoll of Barnaba will be safe. The rest of the low-lying atolls in the archipelago will be submerged. It's kind of interesting for a number of reasons. The early date, I suppose, is one. The fact that this is a sort of rhetoric that we still hear about the Pacific a lot of times is another. But for me, the interesting thing is that this argument is what we often hear in French Polynesia today, where Makatea is the only high island in a sea of low-lying atolls in the Tuamotu archipelago. So for some people, especially those who are trying to protect Makatea from remining, this imagery of Makatea as the Noah's Ark of the Tuamotus, both for species like the endemic rupee bird here, rupee pigeon, that was driven out of Tahiti and only survives on Makatea, and humans as well, you know, this image is regularly evoked and used as a reason to protect it from secondary phosphate mining. In this case, history is mobilized to support a vision of a dystopian, but perhaps realistic, climate change-induced future. If the analogy gains strength when we factor in what natural scientists are saying about Makatea's crucial role as a refugium for birds and other species during previous interglacial high stands or sea level rise. We could also incorporate Makatea's early modern history into this kind of image, where you have the Mihiroa people of the surrounding islands taking refuge in Makatea's cliffs that you see here, protecting themselves from the invading warriors from the island of Anaa. Here, therefore, is a future-facing history that has salience for the climate change era and is summoned by local people as a warning against mining the residual phosphate deposits and therefore potentially lowering the height of the island. If we think of Makatea and Phosphate Islands in general for a second, you know, we should say that they've always been futuristic places. It's hard to imagine this given the dilapidated state of much of the island today, you know, on Makatea or on Barnaba, I think as well. But Makatea was, of course, a very futuristic place until mining ended in 1966. Definitely more so than the surrounding islands, and even more so, I think, than Papeete, the colonial capital. You know, the cinema came to Makatea before other places in Polynesia. Shops, consumer goods, regular wages, cash economy. Cook Islanders came over between 1942 and 1955 and brought back to Rarotonga futuristic ideas like militant trade unionism. The difference here between futurity and modernity, I think, is a fine one that somebody might want to pick me up on. But at an individual or family level, people did come to Makatea from all over because it was a place of the future, a stepping stone to bigger things. Cook Islanders, for example, would earn enough money in Makatea to then afford a one-way trip to New Zealand. So hence we perhaps shouldn't be all that surprised that the mining company that has been trying to gain a license to remine Makatea for over a decade is called Avenir Makatea, Makatea's future. For them, a return to mining is the way for Makatea to re-find its status as a modern, if not futuristic island. But the point I want to make today is that not everyone agrees with the company's vision for the future. Way back in 2016, when I was doing fieldwork in Tahiti, the company put on an exhibition in Papeete to help convince people of the merits of their project. The exhibition, the 3-day exhibition, was called Makatea, Passé, Présent, Avenir. All the advertising posters around town had been covered in graffiti, like you can see here, expressing the displeasure of at least some of the public regarding the company's plans. I think whether people were for or against the mining proposal, for me, as a mere outsider looking in, the 3-day exhibition could almost be compared to Nauru's Commission of Inquiry in the late 1980s. For the first time in many decades, Makatean or Mihiroa landowners were presented with an opportunity to publicly discuss their visions for the future, a right that was denied to them in 1966 when the original mining company decided to get up and leave. They started mining manganese on Vanuatu, and they left all this industrial and environmental waste and had the cheek to gift it to the local territorial government in the form of a 1 franc symbolic gift. For Avenir Makatea, the mining company, the version of the past that supports their vision of the future is the idea that Makatea's mining history was glorious, and ever since there has been a decline in the island's fortunes. For those against the remining project, however, more critical histories about things such as, phosphate dust induced illnesses, respiratory illnesses, and environmental damage have emerged. So we've got these two competing visions of the past, depending on the certain futures that people have in mind. Since then, Avenir Makatea has merged with this new company called Chatham Rock Phosphate. This is a New Zealand-based mining company that is looking to gain a license to mine the Chatham Rise seabed for its phosphate deposits. This has only raised suspicions about the company's larger intentions as more and more Polynesians are growing increasingly concerned about the potential extension of this deep sea mining frontier throughout their extensive exclusive economic zone. French Polynesia, one of the largest EEZs in the world. Of course, this is the reason why the French state wants to hold on to it for as long as possible. So Chatham Rock's Phosphate, they've made a request for a permit to mine Makatea, and this has been sent to Metropolitan France at the moment for closer investigation. We're awaiting the results of this inquiry. So just to, now moving towards my conclusion, I want to return back. I want to return to that second question posed by the Nauruan Commission of Inquiry about the feasibility of rehabilitating phosphate islands. I think the answer is yes. It is clear that the rehabilitation of these phosphate islands is becoming increasingly feasible as technology improves and the price of phosphate continue to rise on the world commodities market. But the question mark at this point is not just on the feasibility of rehabilitation, but it's about doing rehabilitation in the right way. It's about rehabilitating these islands in the ways that local people actually want or need. If we listen to the colonial era logic, some might say that it's very rich of these islanders not to want rehabilitation now that non-islanders are offering it to them. We also have other sort of logics at play, people like the economist Helen, who will point out that in Nauru's case, they actually had the chance to rehabilitate their island with the settlement money as well as profits that they gained from post-independence mining. But they blew it with these well-publicized poor investments in the 1990s. We shouldn't ignore this sort of argument, but I think that history shows us that a better response to this sort of accusation is that rehabilitation will simply be doing what was owed and what is long overdue. And that if it's going to be undertaken, then we have to make sure that it's done in the proper way. Despite not being allowed to complete its course at the International Court of Justice, the Nauruan case showed, I think, that the responsibility for rehabilitation almost universally now lies with miners. So I want us to return to this final image of Phosphate Islands, the one here, Nauru being an environmental challenge for Australia and the Pacific. The fact that people of Makatea have finally been given their chance to start thinking about their future in positive terms is a great thing. But the pressure to make the right decision is once again putting considerable strain on the community. Like the Barnabans and Nauruans with their respective choices about resettlement, or all the Phosphate Islanders actually and their decisions to accept mining at the start of the 20th century. The rhetoric around Makatea is that this is their one shot at rehabilitation. And if they say no, no, we would prefer to do it on our own terms, perhaps once French Polynesia reaches independence, for example. The fear that is being thrown out there is that it will then be too late. There's one chance to do it now. So here, perhaps we're talking about the extension of a 20th century phosphate imperialism into the 21st century. We can replace the idea of destroying phosphate islands through mining by this term rehabilitating phosphate islands through mining. Nobody is quite sure what the result will be just yet. I'm very much not sure myself. In Makatea's case, and this is something that the Tahitian independent leaders realize, the value of this resource is only going to increase in the future. It would be better if they could hold on to it for as long as possible and make sure that the benefit goes to the future independent state instead of allowing an overseas company to come in and profit from it as quickly as possible. My final slide, I promise. I just want to end in the same place as where we started. It would be fitting to note that I think one of the most galling things about these modern rehabilitation efforts on Nauru is that the refugee detention centres were actually set up on land set aside for rehabilitation trials. One of the most compelling outside speakers at the Nauruan Commission of Inquiry was the Australian ecologist Harry Butler, who spoke of the importance of education in turning young Nauruans into Futurians, that is, students concerned with the future of Nauru. You probably couldn't get much further from that vision, I don't think, than with the spectre of these, indeterminate detention centres established on topside. Thank goodness one hopes that this period of history is behind us. Perhaps like Hammer Robert suggested at this Commission of Inquiry, Nauruans might be able to go back to being Coral Islander people again. In this respect, basing their economy around the Blue Pacific, there's also the ironically named Nauru Agreement regarding fishing licenses. Perhaps this is a possible future to head towards, and it's even more impressive if you might have a rehabilitated topside to sort of provide further economic opportunities. One final thing I want to add is that Nauruans, during this Commission of Inquiry, started articulating this intention that they should explore the potential of seabed minerals in their exclusive economic zone, something that the Nauruan government seems very interested in again today and is causing a bit of trouble amongst Micronesian states. But that might be a subject of another paper. I hope that wasn't too rushed. It might have been, but thanks for listening. Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Nick. Don't go away yet when you say bye.
Yeah, sorry, I got question time, don't I?
If you want to take your slideshow down.
For sure.
Yeah. That was fantastic and really interesting to sort of look at the past to think about the future. Reminds me of, I think, one of our PHA conferences, Ron Crocombe was talking about the need for historians to become futurists. So you're following in his footsteps, Nick. There's a lot of sort of tricky questions there, really, when you talk about rehabilitation, obviously, and the social and political issues involved. And I'd just like to put it over now to our audience to invite comments and questions. Just put your hand up, please, or use the raised hand feature on the Zoom panel.
Thanks, Jackie. Just to point out there, that Ron Crocombe reference, that's really useful. And the other person from that era, I guess, was Ben Finney. I remember he wrote a short sort of book yeah, speculating about futurists as well. That was in the context of the space race, I think. Yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it was a long time ago.
I was just going to say there's been some comments in the comments section that we might be able to, you might be interested in addressing, Nick. Gregory Cushman, could you perhaps read out your comment or?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hello from Tucson, Arizona, where I now reside. Yes, I have two comments actually. Maybe I'll get them both out of the way. One, I actually will make into a question. I commented here that, of course, the mid-19-teens replanting attempts on Banaba failed because this was the worst La Nina drought of the whole region, of the whole half century. It was very disingenuous by the perception of the managers at the time to say that this was a failure just because it was impossible, because everyone knew this was a horrible drought. And this leads to a question, Nick. Very good to hear your presentations, especially on Makatea, which I think is the island that needs the most attention from us as historians. Is that climate variability and the challenges that this presents are often pushed off the table when talking about the environment. This was something that was just routine through my research on the management of these islands, even to the extent that I thought the most scandalous thing I discovered. I don't know if this file has ever been released for public viewing now at the National Archives in the UK, but there was a there was a reserved file about how Rombi Island was even sold to Henry Maude, and the circumstantial evidence I reconstructed is because the Lever Brothers plantation was destroyed by a hurricane in 1940 or 1941 that nobody talked about. Even now, nobody talks about, again, to this extent that why aren't people giving attention to not only that climate changes, but that these places are subject to extreme droughts, in the case of Rombi, to tropical cyclones. That seems like a crucial element in this.
Thanks, Gregory, and this is wow. I didn't see you there in the Zoom call. It's great to have you here. Of course, your book is quite inspiring for a lot of people. Yeah, I don't quite know how to attack this question. I suppose the hurricane on Rombi there meant that Maude could pick it up for cheap as well if the coconut plantation had been destroyed. And then, of course, the Barnabans also arrive in the hurricane season, so they have a hard time of things there. But yeah, no, I think I'm just thinking about what was talked about in that commission of inquiry when they were talking about, resoiling or replanting Nauru, and yes, the dry, the lack of rain was definitely an issue that they would talk about a lot, and they would make these comparisons with Barnaba. Of course, one of the reasons why the Barnabans, might have been more open to accepting the original mining deal at the start of the 20th century is because, yeah, they also had been coming out of a drought. Was it in the 1890s, I think? So, as a population, they were, not in the best state of health, and they would have been, interested by this proposition for mining. I also make that point in my thesis about Makatea as well, that the original mining phosphateers, the prospectors, came just several months after a huge cyclone that destroyed a lot of a village in Makatea as well. So these people, I think it's just sheer luck, that these phosphateers are arriving at these times where local populations are not, feeling strong, and then they are more, they're not coerced into taking these deals, but they're more interested in taking them, perhaps. Your wider points, though, I'll take them on definitely, Greg. Thank you.
We have a question from Dario. Dario, are you
Hello.
unmuted?
Yes, I had trouble to find my unmute button. Thank you, Nick. Like, you know, it's not rhetoric, it's a really interesting paper. I loved it a lot. I have one question and a comment. So your paper immediately reminded me of an excellent ethnography that I read quite recently, Felix Ringel's Back to the Post-Industrial Future. And so I was thinking that maybe also looking at how, let's say, the industrialization literature tackles with similar problems could be, you know, an interesting point of comparison for you. I have many points. I will probably just chat with you some other time about this, especially about the futurities. But I think what your research is actually doing is quite interesting diagnosis of what, you know, where capitalism is at. And there is this kind of disjointed idea that somehow the Pacific is out of, you know, this actual framework. But all that you have been talking about could be also be explored through, let's say, the supranational legal frameworks. So there is this kind of big battle between states and companies that is kind of the trademark, one of the characteristic features, let's say, of neoliberalism. So I was wondering, like, if you are, you know, thinking about also to incorporate this higher, let's say, levels in your research. You just make me think, which is excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Dario, for those comments. Yeah, I'll definitely follow you up on that reference to post-industrial futures. Well, so I guess I've been following. If we want to talk about the present, I've been following this mining company, Avene Makatea, an Australian-led mining company, for quite a while, and I guess actually the work of Alexander Moyer is quite interesting here, where he talks about places like the floating islands of Tahiti that they were trying to set up, these sort of neoliberal utopian tax-free havens, you know, for all sorts, and you know that ended up failing. Well, while I was in Tahiti for the first time doing this research about Makatea, or the remining of Makatea, this, you know, those two places, Makatea and this offshore island, were the two big issues in Tahitian in the Tahitian press at the time. And they're both, and the interesting thing then, I suppose, is the government, the territorial government, you know, are in this bind where they, you know, they're really after foreign income, but have got the mandate towards the people. And then the people, of course, in French Polynesia, after the nuclear testing periods, are very reluctant to accept these sort of big new sort of industries in the territory. The other one, of course, is the Howe fish farm, aquaculture farm on the former nuclear testing island Howe in the Tuamotu archipelago. So all these things have been, you know, we've got these companies, yes, because the French Polynesian government's policy is to attract foreign investment, but they've all been delayed for a very long time because of all, and there's all these issues about, who's gonna, sovereignty, you know, the sovereignty issues as well. And this is moving into the whole, French Polynesian independence, push for independence, that they've got to be careful about these companies hollowing out their sovereignty before they even get there. But Dario, the wider points, I appreciate them. Thank you very much.
We've got a little debate going on here on the side between Katerina and Gregory. Well, not really a debate, but Katerina, did you want to speak to your point about health being used in the agreement on Banaba?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think it's important not to paint a picture of the early days of mining as one where, oh, the Barnabans were not doing so well and unhealthy, and then the miners came along, and this was a bit of a, an opportunity for them, because my sense of what's in the archives and the records and the photographs as well of the time were a pretty healthy looking population that was quite vibrant and engaged in lots of different, cultural and other sorts of activities. Yes, there was a drought in the 19th century. Later in the 19th century, there was displacement to other islands. Things were pretty dire. That drought was always a challenge for Barnabans, but they'd gotten through it over the centuries. And Barnabans who were dispersed as part of that, what they were experiencing during that drought before mining started, fought really hard to come back to Barnaba, right? Because they were living on other people's lands in Hawaii and other places. So they made a concerted effort to come back, because that was their indigenous land. So they weren't like looking around for people to save them on Barnaba and mine their island. We characterize that period because, not only because we know the population was pretty resilient over many different kinds of environmental challenges over the years, but because the record also indicates a pretty vibrant, healthy, culturally active population that then actually was bad luck for them that the miners come on just as they were probably recovering from all the devastation of those displacements and movements and attempts to return to their home island and loss of a lot of their elders, etc. So I think it's just you just have to be a bit careful, because it kind of gives a pass to companies like this if populations are desperate for something, or if they're characterized that way. And they weren't, and the consultations were not thorough, and every Barnaban was a landowner. So you can't imagine that the terms of the lease were very clear to every single landowner, which included women and children.
No, thank you so much. And I see Gregory's done a nice response to that as well in the chat. But look, this gets to that whole core of the issue that Harry Morden, those letters that he wrote, saying, oh, Barnaba was never a lush place. But the point is that, just people have been living in this climate for so long and perfectly adaptable as well. Just if I could make a comparison to the Makatea case, where there was, of course, there was not a lot, but there was also, a lot of opposition to these early people who came and tried to sign contracts with them. The thing that convinced the Makateans that, this might be all right is that, the Pacific Phosphate Company was saying, no, look at what we've done in Barnaba and Nauru a few years ago. And in these contracts, we've got clauses that we're going to replace your coconut trees and things like that. So once they heard that, the Makatea people said, okay, cool, we'll sign the contract. I think it is, I agree 100%. And it is interesting to just look at the phosphate companies and how they use these as argumentative tools, I suppose.
And Max has pointed out that Thomas McMahon's photos support a vibrant community with continuing cultural practices on Nauru and Barnaba. So thanks, Max, for that viewpoint. Do we have any comments or questions from anyone else?
I think Max has got his hand up.
Oh, Max, I'm not looking at you. I was looking at your words.
Sorry, great, Nick. That was fantastic. I'm very disappointed, though, that you forgot to mention my favourite little island, Malden Island.
Oh, right.
9 out of 10. Sorry, bad luck. I was going to give you 10, but 9. No, my question is, I recall a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about working topside on Barnaba and crushing the pinnacles, creating rock, and then selling that rock as landfill to Japan. This was a scheme that was talked about quite a bit maybe this is 10 years, 15 years ago, maybe. Do you know anything about that? Has that ever popped up in your research at all? It was a scheme, I think, related more to Barnaba than to Nauru, but I think it was discussed on Nauru as well. I remember having discussions on Nauru about it. But nothing ever happened, I don't think. It was one of those wild schemes of rehabilitate out of it and then selling off the excess rock to Japan for landfill.
Yeah, I could imagine that's the case of these links with Japan. Of course, you know, we talk about phosphate going to Australia and New Zealand mainly, but I think as Gregory Cushman points out in his book, Japan was a massive market for the stuff as well. So these colonial era relationships have continued. And for instance, the reason why the company was trying to mine Makatea knows about Makatea is this was an Australian company selling coal to Japan. Selling coal to Japan. Japan wanted to know where they could put their fly ash. They had this waste fly ash, and these people suggested, oh, what about Makatea? It's a place with lots of holes. We could fill up the holes with this waste. So there are there's lots of links to Japan that and there's also, lots of these projects that have been proposed, and it's really hard to get on top of them all and keep track of them, especially, I'm a little bit younger, so I probably wasn't alive for a lot of these things even, and the newspaper record doesn't go up, well, at least the online newspaper record doesn't cover this period. So it is kind of the next research phase that I'm going to go into, I think, Max. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, good.
And we've got some comments there on the side, another one from Gregory. Thank you, Gregory. About a major native critique of mining from the beginning focused on the destruction of island freshwater aquifers and water caves, and that sort of fell by the wayside in later discussions. And Frank Thomas, we're sort of jumping between the very distant past and the future, and the recent past. But Frank Thomas tells us that we know little about the paleoecology of Barnaba and Nauru. So we can't be sure how long these islands have been settled, according to radiocarbon dates anyway, and how people have adapted to changing environments. I don't know if there's much in the way in the oral histories or traditions that speaks to that, but it's just another thought. Any other? Helen.
Thanks very much, Nick. Fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed it. Look, this is perhaps a question from left field, but it refers to the destruction of Aboriginal lands in Australia and the whole question of sovereignty, dispossession, and the arguments about rehabilitation or not rehabilitating lands on that have suffered mining in Australia. Is there any value in bringing those kinds of questions to this kind of history?
Thanks, Helen. The thing that immediately jumps to mind, and I am hoping to write a paper about this, is the way the Nauruans invoked what Australia was doing with Maralinga and the nuclear tests there. So in the 1980s, the Hawke government, so the Hawke government being elected into power sort of is what gave the Nauruans hope that they might be able to come to a fair deal with the Australians about rehabilitation. The interesting thing is that, the Maralinga issue, a nuclear testing site by, a British nuclear testing site, local people wanting compensation, wanting rehabilitation there, and the Australians saying it's not our responsibility, it's the responsibility of the British, so we're not going to deal with you here. So the Nauruans were saying, hang on, so you're here in Australia saying it's not your responsibility, it's the British responsibility, but our argument saying that it's not our responsibility, it's your responsibility in Nauru, is somehow different, that sort of logic. So that's something that I'm exploring at the present. But yeah, Helen, the idea of rehabilitation of environmentally degraded places due to mining, Nauru was at the cutting edge of all that in Australia. You know, in the 1960s, these sort of studies that they did about rehabilitation that kind of kicked off. It was before Whitlam. You know, a lot of people say, you know, it was Whitlam who created this this precedent, but you know, they were exploring it with Nauru before that in the 60s as well. So the two histories, yeah, do overlap.
And just to jump a little bit even further left than Helen, left field, if we're talking about rehabilitation, of course, now in Aotearoa, we're talking about rehabilitating the farmlands that were, not all of them, but that were made possible by partly possible by the phosphate that came from those islands. And now we're talking about, reverting or trying to encourage Indigenous forests and so on land that had been developed in the name of agriculture.
Yeah, exactly. And it was superphosphate, of course, that came there as fertilizer runoff. And that's the irony of the people trying to mine Makatea today who are branding their phosphate as organic. It is low cadmium stuff. You know, this is Makatea's competitive advantage. It means the price is higher than it might have been if it wasn't. But yeah, they've actually gained organic certification for their product before mining has started. But it's interesting how these certification things must work, because yeah, there's a lot of Indigenous people in French Polynesia, Mahi Nui, who wouldn't agree with that, I don't think. So yeah, there's funny.
Just goes on and on and on.
It goes on and on and on. And of course, other scholars have done this really well, capturing all that. Katerina's one, Gregory's another. Yeah.
So it looks like one of our future PHA conferences, Safua, if you're listening, will have to be on I can't pronounce it, Futurities.
Futurities. That's good. I thought you were going to suggest it should be in Palmerston North at Massey University.
No,
at least you didn't suggest that. Yeah.
No way. Right, unless we've got any very final last minute comments, can't see any hands up. I'd like to thank you, Nick, once again for a fantastic presentation, really well put together. I'd like to thank our audience for joining in and for your wonderful comments and questions. And I'd also like to thank Helen for working on the technical side of things. So we will be, we've recorded this, so we will put this up on the PHA webpage. So without further ado, I wish you all a very lovely day, and see you next month for when Associate Professor Tina Delisle from the University of Minnesota will talk to us about placental politics, which looks to be also a really interesting webinar. Just to let you know that the September webinar will be at 8 a.m. Australia time. We had to do this to sort of fit in with the North American time zone. I don't have a mailing list for these meetings. I'm not doing that, but if you just keep your eye on the PHA web page or the PHA Facebook page, you'll see when these are coming up. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. Helen, did you have something you wanted?